So we're talking about ministering to the margins, and we're talking about today the Black community. And I want to um, start by talking a little bit about what it means to, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a part of the Black church. I'm going to share from my own personal experience a little bit, but I also want to talk a little bit about some of the generational changes that we're seeing and how that might inform what it means to minister to the margins right now. Um, I also do not mind being interrupted. So feel free to interrupt me if you have questions, if something doesn't make sense. And um, and then we'll do some Q&A. Barbara, about how much time do I have?
Um, as much as the Lord allows you. But we end officially at 1. But if you have 28, even 25
Okay.
minutes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about me. Thank you, Barbara, for introducing me. I cannot believe that Barbara used to be one of my students because we're probably now the same age. Um, Uh, but it's so good to see her, and I'm excited for her and her family and what she's doing in ministry. Um, so I grew up in Englewood, New Jersey, and I grew up attending um, what I would have called a very stereotypical Black Baptist church. I grew up at a church where um, we learned the Bible, we talked about Jesus, and the only other theologian I knew was Martin Luther King. And um, even though we were in New Jersey, I just want you to imagine that and I didn't have time to pull it together, but there's um, there's a stained glass. Let me see if I can find it on my computer. I grew up at a church where there is a stained glass of a Black Jesus. And I have it. Do I have sharing privileges? Do I have share privileges? Okay. Um, I'll pull up this picture. Um, Small, but hopefully you can see a little bit. Can you all see that picture? I know it's really tiny. So this was the image of Jesus I grew up seeing in my church. And even though the church was over 100 years old, this particular building was built in the 60s. And I always think about how intentional they were when they built the church. And they installed this stained glass that Jesus is Black, and you can't really see it here, the detail, but he's got different shades of Black in him, right? So, he's kind of light skin, dark skin, a little bit everything in between. And I grew up at a church where um, our chapel, let me see if I can stop share now. I grew up at a church where our chapel was named the Chapel of the Four Little Girls. And it was named after the four little girls who had been killed by a bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, when they were attending Sunday school. And in our church archives are pictures of when Rosa Parks came to visit and pictures of our pastor participating in different civil rights movements and different things. We have telegraphs from some of the parents of the little girls who were killed in the bombing. And I say all that because that informed how I understood Christianity. It informed how I understood the gospel. That Jesus wasn't just concerned about our soul salvation, but Jesus was also concerned about our lived experiences, particularly as people of color. And and we were, and later on, we reflected most often on Luke 4, verses 18 through 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's how I came to understand who Jesus is, understanding this notion of salvation, sozo, as not just being a person's soul salvation, right? Sozo, the Greek word for that we see being saved, right? When Jesus talks about the woman with the issue of blood, and he says, "Your faith has healed you." He uses that word sozo, and so the my how I came to understand the gospel was that Jesus cared not just about my soul, but he also cared about my social situation, right? This woman with the issue of blood wasn't just saved, having now found a relationship with Jesus Christ, but she was also now placed in a social situation where she was no longer ostracized, right? Because of her issue with blood, because of the hemorrhaging, she was no longer ostracized. She was able to be welcomed back into community. And I took that seriously. I took it seriously, not just reading the Gospels, but also reading, of course, we know the story of the Exodus and reading the prophets and looking at the arc of the Bible as a text of liberation for people. I now presently serve as the pastor of justice, advocacy, and compassion at a multi-ethnic church. Um, and it wasn't until I came to seminary, and I'm gonna be very honest with you all, it wasn't until I came to seminary, till I went to seminary, that I realized that there were other people who did not read the gospel the way I did, who didn't read the Bible the way I did. And when I came to this position at my church, and I love the church, it's a wonderful church, it's multi-ethnic. But now I am in the position where I have to translate an understanding of the gospel and give language to something that was so natural and so part of my faith formation. And this has been good to me because I've had to give language to it. So just before I came on this call, we had a staff meeting and I led them through chapter 1 on Jesus and the disinherited. And one of the things that came up in that conversation, which is not unusual, it's a staff. Today we had about 15 people there, pastors and church staff and all kinds of people. Um, one of the women on staff, pastor, and I'm not calling her out because it's the same for many of us. She said, I went through seminary. I'm not going to name her seminary, but she said, I went through seminary and I've never heard of this man. She had never heard of Howard Thurman. And I think about the jewels that are present within the Black church, within the Black religious tradition that um, that so many in the dominant culture have not been exposed to. And honestly, that um, some of Black churches have not been exposed to. So I highly recommend, because I'm on my commercial for Howard Thurman this week, read Jesus and the Disinherited. Because what's so important about what he talks about is that if we take seriously who Jesus is, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was poor. Jesus was a part of the minority culture at the time under Roman Empire. And God chose for him to be birthed in that situation. And if we take that seriously, that Jesus has a word of liberation for people who he terms has their backs up against the wall. And that and yes, birthed by a teenage woman, right? A teenage young woman who was unwed at the time. Right? All kinds of complications that mess up our nice cookie cutter theology. And he was a Palestinian Jew, putting that in there too. But when we take seriously who Jesus is, that Jesus actually has a word of liberation for those whom Thurman terms have their backs against the world, a wall, those who we might term are oppressed. And as we look at our world today, that not only includes, right now we're talking about the Black community, but we see our Latino brothers and sisters under assault, our Somali brothers and sisters, our Haitian brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters, sort of anyone who does not look white, who does not present white, is under assault under this administration. And um, and I think what's so I'm gonna come back around to this, but what I think is so important is that if we study the Black church and if we study Black religious tradition, it has gems that will help us and keep us in this moment. And unfortunately, so many of us have been formed, whether through our church traditions or through our theological institutions, our seminaries, our Bible colleges, wherever we've grown up, we have been formed in a particular tradition of Christianity that um, is the Christianity of empire right now. And we have not paid enough attention to the history that comes in, and because we are talking about Black people today, the history that comes out of the Black religious tradition. And I think it behooves us, particularly in this moment, to spend some time there, to spend some time understanding how a group of oppressed people maintain their faith under oppression. Because what we're seeing in this administration, and I'm going to get off what's happening right now in a moment, but what we're seeing in this administration and in this country right now is um, a form of so-called Christianity that actually values whiteness, that values power, that values strength. And this is not Jesus, right? This is not the Jesus of the gospel. And if we're not careful, many will be turned away from the faith if they haven't been already. Because this gospel that is being proclaimed in this nationalism has no space for people who are hurting. You know, one of the questions that we wrestled with this morning in my staff meeting is the question that Thurman raises, like, what does the gospel have to say to people who are struggling? What does the gospel have to say to people who are afraid of ICE coming after them? What does the gospel have to say to people who are losing their health insurance? What does the gospel have to say to people who find themselves in cycles, generational poverty? And this is not to suggest at all that the Black experience is wholly and exclusively oppressive, right? That we're always under under oppression. That's not the case at all. But we do have to recognize we live within an empire. And so I think one of the gems of the Black church, particularly in this moment, is that we have a history of survival. And that history of survival is not just making it through, but it speaks to living out our faith that is not just looking at the ends, but is looking at the means. And this is, again, because I'm on my commercial for Howard Thurman this week. Howard Thurman was very concerned about our inner souls, our inner lives. our inward center, as he calls it. And that's so important because in this moment in time, it's not just enough for us to be right. We have to be righteous. That's what slave tradition teaches us. That's what the civil rights tradition teaches us. It's not just about getting to the end. It's about maintaining our witness throughout. And this is where the church is so um, critical in this moment because there are plenty of people who care about justice as a social issue. They care about justice as a human rights issue. But only the church understands God's justice from a biblical, righteous position. If we're reading the prophets, if we're reading Jesus, right? If we're living that out, that we're not just trying to get to equity, but we're actually trying to be righteous in the journey. That we're actually trying to maintain our witness along the way. So I think that's one of the gems of the Black church. I think the other gem of the Black church is joy. And I say that because it's so important in this season. There's so much pain. There's so much heartache. Um, we are bombarded every day by the news. And if you're kind of like me, a kind of a news junkie, you're hearing it from all sides and everywhere, and it can be overwhelming. But what the Black church can teach us, if we're willing to listen and learn, is that there is still space for joy. There is still, alongside of our lament is joy and worship and praise and seeing the goodness of God in the land of the living. And so survival and endurance is not without joy. It's not without song. It's not without dance. It's not without good food, right? It's not without celebration. And and that needs to be infused into our churches. It needs to be infused into this moment because we're not going to survive if we're just living off of lament. We're not going to survive if we're just living off of the pain. We as the church have to show the world God's hand at work, even now. Um, Samuel DeWitt Proctor says that the goal of the preacher is to tilt life Godward, that we're always showing our people what it means to look up. And so in this moment, the beauty of the church is to show people how to look up. Like, look up and see what God is doing. Look up and see the baby and smile, right? Look up and come together as a community and dance and sing. These are the songs of the civil rights movement. These are the songs of slave religion, right? That we can infuse joy even now. So that's sort of like the history that I don't want us to lose. And I think is important and helpful for us in this moment. But what I'm noticing, and I don't know if this is, Barbara, you can speak to this or some others. What I'm noticing is a generational shift when it comes to ministering to the Black community. We have this rich, deep history that is formed out of struggle and oppression. But we also have this new generation, and we can see it most, I think, prevalently in music. So I'm using music as an example for right now. um, the shift more and more towards Christian contemporary music, praise and worship music. The language, the lyrics are not born out of struggle anymore. It's a different language. Um, it is more individualistic. It's not wrong. It's still biblical. Many of the songs are very um, uh, biblical, but it's a little bit more individualistic. It's and it doesn't speak to struggle. And I use it as an example, and I can't think of songs right now off the top of my head, but Google Maverick City and the controversy going on there. And if you want in the Q&A, I can talk more about that. But I think what we're seeing that's happening generationally is that our younger generations who have not experienced struggle do not hold in their hearts the reverence for the Black church experience. And because many of them have not experienced struggle in the same way, the way we talk about church and the way we talk about living out our faith um, has to shift a little bit as well. I think for generations, ministering to the Black community meant ministering to people who were very acutely aware of their social situation. I think often it meant ministering to people who felt daily or at least regularly what it means to be oppressed. And I believe as the Black church and as the Black community has gained more social status, how oppression has shifted and what it looks like now, um, younger generations don't feel that same oppression. They don't feel that same despair, and they're looking for something different in their worship experience. They don't want to hear about how we got over. They are looking to experience um, a a Christianity um, that I would say is devoid of struggle. And I think part of that is probably just generationally, right? We can talk about how people have parented differently over generations. Younger generations tend to have not had to struggle, right? Because their parents have hovered over them and made sure they had all they needed and, all those kinds of things. Um, but in some ways, that means people feel disconnected from the church, from that historical, um, the history of the Black church experience. Um, and yet there's still a need to speak to the daily challenges that people face that in some ways are universal, but in some ways maybe hit the Black community a little bit more harshly, right? There's still a need for the church to be not just the space where people receive spiritual formation, but it's also the place where they get to learn about parenting, where they get to learn about how to manage their finances, where they get to learn about how to take care of their health, how to advocate for for their children in schools. There is a way in which the Black church has traditionally and must still um, speak holistically to those in the congregation. Um, I think I went off track for a second, so hold on. Um, Mhm. And I think in this generation, people are looking um, for honesty and transparency and vulnerability and for um, a faith community that takes seriously what it means to follow Jesus. And I think sometimes we can get caught up by the memes on social media. We can get caught up in the flashy, preachers and all their things that they're doing. But at the end of the day, people want authentic relationship.